Carter's announcement that agreement had been signed with the Iranians for release of the hostages. It ends with the hostages still in captivity and a world uncertain as to just what is holding up their freedom for at least another agonizing day. The Iranians said the United States at the last moment had tried to slip in some new conditions. The United States and diplomatic sources in Tehran said they understood the delay was because Iran had forgotten to sign one of the banking agreements. That would indicate merely a technical delay, of course, and American officials said they thought it was not a serious problem. But that was before Iran's chief negotiator, Behzad Nabavi, claimed that Algerian intermediaries had been handed an appendix to the agreement, a demand by United States banks, he claimed, on Iranian assets. Nabavi called this an underhanded maneuver delaying final solution to the problem. The delay again clouded the hopes of the hostage families, of course. It denied Mr. Carter his hopes of greeting the hostages in Wiesbaden while still the president, and it brought a warning from the White House that the inauguration of Ronald Reagan at noon tomorrow could force a reopening of the negotiations. We have a series of reports, our first from Leslie Stahl at the White House.
Jimmy Carter's last full day as President of the United States found him once again at the mercy of the Iranians, who, for reasons not fully understood here, have still not signed a final implementing document that would start funds flowing into an escrow account, which in turn would trigger the release of the hostages. As of tonight, no funds have been placed in escrow, and the Americans, Iranians, and Algerians are still talking. At the White House, spokesman Jody Powell announced that because of the delay, time had run out, and President Carter would be denied his fervent wish of flying off to West Germany to greet the hostages before Ronald Reagan's inauguration. At a briefing, Powell suggested that the deal could possibly unravel, and in an apparent attempt to pressure Iran, he renewed a warning that if the process is not completed by noon tomorrow, the new Reagan administration has the perfect freedom to begin with some new approach. Powell said, nevertheless, that the White House is still optimistic about a resolution, adding, "Nothing has arisen that might not have been anticipated. No differences have arisen about the principle, and nothing has arisen that we do not believe can be worked out." Despite the positive public statements here, there's no question that this delay was not anticipated. At 8 o'clock this morning, Air Force One was rolled out and put on standby for a possible departure for Germany. Some White House officials believe that the Iranians are deliberately delaying the agreement in order to deprive Jimmy Carter, whom they have so often called the Great Devil, his final wish: to greet the hostages in Germany while he is still president. Jody Powell announced, however, that President-elect telephoned Mr. Carter this morning to invite him to represent the United States when the hostages are released and to make the trip to West Germany even after the inauguration. President Carter has accepted. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Reagan's top aides agree with the administration's contention that there is no deal until Iran arranges for its escrow payments. And they concur with the White House that if that doesn't happen by noon tomorrow, then President Reagan won't be bound by anything in the signed agreements. The Reagan team, however, is not anxious to move in any other direction. "We are simply," said one of them, "following the administration's lead." In meetings this morning with his cabinet and advisors, Reagan asked his aides to form a committee of officials to provide continuity in the event that the negotiations do continue.
Certain people, and I won't be specific as to which ones, will be asked to stay. There will be certain people that will be brought in very quickly and briefed so that there is total continuity. As to whether Mr. Christopher specifically will be staying on, I'm not sure.
Is the indication
his advice and counsel up to this point has been very valuable, and we will continue to rely on that.
Brady later said that some of the Carter team members, he wouldn't say which ones, have already agreed to stay on if necessary. Reagan was apparently aware of possible delays after speaking to Mr. Carter this morning. He told reporters he still had his fingers crossed and would be nervous until the hostages were off the ground in Tehran.
I think there will be a concern that all of us will feel until we know they're airborne and actually on their way, in view of the history of this whole thing.
Reagan's senior advisors are not particularly anxious to have to continue negotiating with the Iranians. It would be far simpler for the new president to have this crisis behind him. And taking their lead from the Carter White House, the Reagan team remains optimistic that the crisis will be settled. Bill Plant, CBS News at the Blair House.
Secretary of State Muskie said late today that the hostage problems could still be resolved by noon tomorrow when the Carter administration leaves office. He said the current hang-up has to do with the transfer of assets. The Bank of Iran, according to other sources here, has failed to deposit certain papers with the Bank of England setting up an escrow account. Muskie made his comments during a brief farewell ceremony at the State Department, noting that he replaced Secretary Vance because of the hostage crisis.
So it's appropriate, I suppose, that I should have begun this term at a time of high tension with the failure of the rescue mission, and that I should approach the end of this term in another moment of high tension and frustration.
Despite that frustration, officials here are still convinced the hostage deal will go through, although they clearly are disappointed at the delay. State Department spokesman John Tratner, at his noon briefing, was doggedly optimistic.
We have always suggested to you that this is a complicated situation, period. And we have now evolved it to the point of an agreement, and we're going to continue to evolve it to a hostage release.
The situation seems to have retrogressed somewhat since this morning, and once again, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher is back to active negotiating between Algeria and Tehran. Administration officials insist he is now negotiating the implementation of the agreement, not the agreement itself. But that difference is academic at the moment, with the hostages still in Iran. Robert Pierpoint, CBS News at the State Department.
Today's confusing events were compounded by conflicting reports from Tehran. Two Algerian 727s were parked during the day on the tarmac at Tehran's Merodad airport, fueled up and ready to fly the hostages to freedom, presumably to Algiers, where they'd be transferred to hospital planes waiting from Wiesbaden. There were reports the hostages were at the airport in Tehran, reports they were aboard the planes even, a report that one of the planes had taken off. However, all those reports apparently were false. An unidentified Iranian official at the airport said the hostages were not there, that they were in Tehran and would remain there until at least tomorrow morning. As for the two Algerian jets, the official said the crews had returned to their hotel for the night. He said they were due back at the airport at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Tehran time. That would be 11:30 tonight, Eastern time. And so the word tonight is that a weary Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher is negotiating with the Algerians again to clear up one more snag. Early today, while most Americans still slept, word came from Algiers that Christopher had taken a large black and silver pen in his hand to initial the complex agreement with Iran. The deed seemed to be done. John Blackstone reported on that.
At the American Embassy, they were waiting again tonight, waiting for the newly signed agreement to go into effect. Officials would not or could not explain the delay in the hostages' release. Things seem to be moving more quickly early this morning. The agreement, so anxiously awaited for so long, was finally signed. There seemed to be the promise of freedom before the day was over.
We have much to do during the course of the day. This initialing is the beginning of the execution process, in a sense, a process that will involve actions on 3 continents.
For the chief American negotiator, Warren Christopher, and for the mediator, Algeria's foreign minister, Ben Yahya, the last few days had been a race. They were working to reach an agreement before the end of the Carter presidency. It demanded every hour.
You and I have passed the last 48 hours without sleep in order to reach a happy outcome.
Some of the hope of this morning has faded tonight. Elaborate preparations have been made in Algiers in expectation the hostages might stop here, but it's still not known when they'll be on their way to freedom or what their route to freedom might be. John Blackstone, CBS News, Algiers.
Iranian negotiator Nabavi told his countrymen today that the agreement was an Iranian victory. As he put it, Iran, quote, managed to rub in the dirt the nose of the world's biggest oppressor and superpower, unquote. But the terms of the agreement make it clear there has been no U.S. surrender. It's a straight swap of frozen assets owned by Iran for the freedom of the hostages. Swap of frozen assets owned by Iran for the freedom of the hostages. It is by no terms a ransom. The United States also agreed not to intervene in any way in Iranian affairs. It will end all trade sanctions against Iran and will drop its claims against Tehran in the World Court. Also, the United States will act to enable Iran to recover property and assets of the late Shah and his family, and will block all future American lawsuits against Iran resulting from the hostage seizure or the revolution. Any claim, however, of American citizens against Iran or Iranians against the United States will be decided by an international tribunal. These tantalizing film glimpses of the American hostages. The Iranians did so again today, showing some of the captives undergoing medical tests to ensure their good health before release. Tom Fenton in Frankfurt has that story.
The hostages knew their release was imminent by the time Iranian television took these pictures, but they showed no signs of jubilation. As long as they remain within the borders of Iran, they are still captives. These hostages were apparently being fed while the Algerian doctors were conducting medical examinations. It's not clear where the examinations took place. Newsmen in Tehran who attempted to follow the doctors were arrested and temporarily detained by Iranian authorities. Hostage Philip Ward looked nervous and a bit disturbed during his examination. Marine Sergeant John McKeel Jr. wrote to his parents a year ago that he had lost 25 pounds. He looks robust now, but not relaxed. Elizabeth Swift, an embassy political officer and one of the 2 women captives, is described by her mother as a very tough cookie. She appears to be bearing up well. Marine Sergeant Stephen Kirtley has written his family that the first thing he wants to do when he gets home is to take a walk in the woods with his dog and feel what it's like not to be told what to do. William Keogh, former superintendent of the American school in Iran, apparently spent a good deal of his time in captivity reading. Press attaché Barry Rosen appears to be describing his symptoms. He complained of an irregular heartbeat and insomnia during a filmed doctor's visit last March. Navy Lieutenant Commander Bob Engelman, who has a degree in psychology, may have been better equipped to deal with the stress of captivity. Administrative Assistant Stephen Lauterbach looks thin and drawn. Teletype operator Charles Jones Jr. has written his wife that he wants to go someplace quiet and get himself back together when he gets home. Medical experts believe most of the hostages will need to follow his example. Tom Fenton, CBS News, Frankfurt.
Also seen in the Iranian television film were 3 other American hostages: Bert Moore, a State Department consul, Marine Sergeant Kevin Hermaning, and Marine Sergeant Paul Lewis, a U.S. Embassy guard who arrived in Tehran just 1 day before that takeover. That's the way it is. Monday, January 19th, 1981, the 443rd day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, reporting from Washington. Good night.